Greenland has recently become one of the most talked about regions on the planet. And perhaps, in the near future, it may become the most talked about country. The island is actively debating independence from Denmark, while in the United States, some are already rubbing their hands, eyeing Greenland as a potential 51st state. But what is it that suddenly drew so much attention to this giant, yet mostly icy island with a population of just 56,000? Get comfortable. In the next few minutes, you'll encounter Vikings, political intrigue, Cold Wars, and even nuclear disasters. Because the history of Greenland tells a story of its importance better than anything else. Let's start, as tradition goes, from the very distant past. So distant, in fact, that we can confidently say, Greenland is a rightful and historical part of North America. At least from a geological point of view, we've all become somewhat used to intuitively thinking of Greenland as part of Europe. But physically, it's actually much closer to North America than to its so-called parent continent. To be more precise, Greenland is about 320 kilometers away from the nearest European land, Iceland. Meanwhile, the Canadian Ellesmere Island is just 26 kilometers from Greenland's icy shores. Even more importantly, from a tectonic standpoint, Greenland sits squarely on the North American tectonic plate. And Iceland, as it turns out, is quite literally Greenland's geological daughter. Heard about Iceland's famous volcanoes and hot springs? Well, the rift on which Iceland lies, responsible for all that volcanic activity, is in many ways a result of Greenland's ancient tectonic history. Around 70 million years ago, Greenland was located at the site of that rift. Due to complex movements of the Earth's crust in Greenland itself, the rift shifted toward the Denmark Strait, uplifting the seafloor and eventually giving birth to Iceland. That's also why there's ongoing debate about which continent Iceland truly belongs to. Don't tell Donald Trump, but many geologists based on geological history tend to classify Iceland as part of North America as well, though, geographically speaking, it's more accurate to say the island is a unique 50-50 case. Half of it definitely lies in Europe. As for Greenland, there's really no room for debate. It is purely a North American geological product. In fact, over the next several tens of millions of years, Greenland is expected to collide with Canada and become part of the mainland. So why is it currently considered part of Europe? Intuitively, one might recall the Vikings, colonizers, in Denmark, the country that owns the island. But in reality, things are a bit more complex. The first people in Greenland weren't Vikings. They were Eskimos from the northern territories of Canada and possibly even Alaska. Conducting archaeology on the island is still quite a challenge today, and imagining how those early people survived is even harder. Nevertheless, scientists are confident that roughly 4,500 years ago, members of the Sasak culture lived in Greenland. Human DNA, stone tools, and even hut-like structures have been discovered. They were later followed by the Independence and Dorset cultures. The number of archaeological finds is modest, but even that is enough to show that life in Greenland thrived for about 5,000 years. And all of that life, once again, was connected to Canada. Time after time, determined Eskimos came from there to settle on the harsh edge of human habitability. It wasn't until about 4,000 years later, around the year 980, that a Viking named Eric the Red was exiled from Iceland for killing a neighbor. Not hesitating, he sailed to the nearby island, whose silhouette could already be seen from Iceland on clear days. When he returned from exile, he claimed it as his own and gave it the name we know today, Greenland. Of course, scientists still haven't reached a consensus on this. The main hypothesis is that the Viking was simply joking when he named the icy island Greenland. However, this happened during the medieval warm period, and there is solid evidence that even in frigid Norway, people were harvesting double crops of grain near the Arctic Circle. So, it's quite reasonable to assume that some coastal regions of Greenland could have appeared green at that time. Still, the more logical version is that Eric the Red used a clever trick, naming it Greenland to attract fellow Norsemen to colonize the island by painting it as a land of beauty and natural abundance. The only thing that's been scientifically proven about Greenland's green past is that it existed around 450,000 years ago. In 2023, scientists extracted remains from the ice in southern Greenland that confirmed the presence of pine, spruce, and alder trees, along with a variety of flies, beetles, butterflies, and moths. Back then, Greenland was located farther south, and the climate was indeed warm. Summer temperatures exceeded 10 degrees Celsius, and in winter, they rarely dropped below minus 15 degrees Celsius. That's quite a livable range, comparable to what we see in parts of northern Europe today. In other words, life that was absolutely possible. All the more so since sea levels were lower back then, and some of the most livable areas at the time are now hidden beneath the water. But again, this was hundreds of thousands of years before Eric the Red's voyages. His efforts eventually led to Greenland becoming, for its time, a colony megapolis with as many as 400 homes and several settlements. They mainly lived off trade with Europe, selling walrus ivory, but they also raised sheep and actively fished, just as they do today. And considering that the Vikings sailed 300 kilometers from Iceland, it's hard to believe they didn't make the 30-kilometer journey in the other direction to North America. So it wasn't Columbus, but rather the inhabitants of Greenland who were the first to reveal North America to Europe. Eventually, in 1261, they became part of Norway and later, in 1380, part of the union with the Danish kingdom. But then the medieval warm period gave way to a colder climate, and at the same time, settlers from Canada, namely the Inuit, started pushing again. As a result, by 1408, the colonization effort had faded, and for the next 150 years, there were no European settlers in Greenland, only Canadian Inuit. The extinction of the colony is a very intriguing historical mystery, one we highly recommend reading about in your spare time. Greenland was recolonized in 1578, once again under the aegis of Denmark, which until recently, up to July, considered the island its territory. Word by word, step by step, technological progress eventually made it possible to return, at least for whaling. At the same time, 3 Inuit women were brought to the mainland, and a German scientist, Adam Olearius, unexpectedly observed in their behavior certain traits and customs similar to those he had seen among the peoples of northern Russia. After that came a rather uneventful period, when the most notable event was the Battle of Jakobshavn, in which Denmark and the Netherlands fought over whaling rights. The Danes claimed victory and slowly began to recolonize the island. However, it wasn't without its bumps. Locals often complained about Denmark's trade monopoly, which hindered the island's development. Nevertheless, Greenland remained part of Denmark through World War I. The island was declared neutral in advance. But during World War II, with the development of aviation and naval power, things really started to change. Germany occupied Denmark and wanted to use Greenland as a transit base. But on April 9, 1941, the United States signed an agreement with the Danish government in exile to use Greenland for its own needs. In practice, it was the Americans who supplied, built, and traded with Greenland during World War II. It would not be an exaggeration to say that the United States received a colony under temporary administration, and right after the war, they wanted it permanently. Greenland's geographic position between Europe and the United States was simply too advantageous. This had already been foreseen by William Henry Seward, who back in 1867 tried to buy both Greenland and Iceland for the U.S., but was refused. Likewise, in 1946, Denmark declined to sell the island for $100 million, equivalent to only about $1.6 billion in today's money. They were lucky, frankly, because the Cold War hadn't started yet, and the U.S. backed off relatively quickly, agreeing instead to close cooperation. But starting in 1947, the island became strategically critical to U.S. security. In 1947, Time magazine illustrated this clearly by showing the Earth from above and drawing circles that demonstrated how easily and conveniently targets in the USSR, Asia, and even Japan could be struck from Greenland and Alaska. Importantly, launch systems were easy to hide there. Missiles would fly over the North Pole, where there are no people or radar stations. In short, for the U.S., Greenland is an unsinkable aircraft carrier, permanently anchored in the most advantageous spot. This is how the Thule Air Base appeared in Greenland, and the number of American soldiers on the island kept increasing, which caused tension with the local population The peak of this tension came with the nuclear disaster in 1968, when a B-52 bomber carrying 6 hydrogen bombs crashed near the airbase. Officially, no contamination was recorded, but locals complained that for many generations after, animals were born with deformities. There was also an even more exotic project called Iceworm, under which the U.S. planned to hide intercontinental ballistic missile launch sites under the ice. A small town was even built. But after 8 years, it became clear that glaciers move unpredictably, and therefore it would be impossible to hide anything under them. The project was shut down, but all the waste, including nuclear, was simply left inside the glaciers. That's why environmentalists are still seriously alarmed, because those very glaciers are now melting. And the gifts in the form of radioactive contamination are about to reach not only the people of Greenland, but also all the countries that consume its products. And there are many such countries, as Greenland's fishing industry is highly profitable. But just like its geology, this trade is problematic for Denmark. Because of Greenland's proximity to North America, most of its trade goes through Canada and the US, which became a huge problem after Denmark and Greenland joined the European Union. Even back in 1982, there were already talks of independence, so they could continue duty-free trade with America. At that time, the issue was resolved by granting Greenland broad autonomy. So much so that Greenland has its own flag, official Greenlandic language, and independent foreign policy. And since 2009, Greenland has had the right to manage its own natural resources, which it has in abundance. 31.4 million barrels of oil and 4.2 trillion cubic meters of gas. That's a lot. But the country fears the environmental consequences and, since 2021, has banned all extraction, which, as you can imagine, frustrates both Denmark and the US. Nevertheless, few people in Greenland care about their opinion, because 90% of the island's population are descendants of Eskimos and Inuits from North America. Only 10% are descendants of European colonists. And this is precisely why the question of an independent Greenland is considered rhetorical by many researchers. But that is a completely different story. Now you are fully familiar with the history of Greenland. So what should its people do? Stay with Denmark, gain independence, or join the United States? Share your opinion in the comments, and that's all from us for now. See you next time.